Welcome to Explosive Enterprises, and today we've got a pre-production sample of a new revision to the Wii SCAR-L. This is part of a version 3.1 line, introducing steel parts to several of their models to correct long-standing issues of erosion to pop metal fire control parts. Is this enough to make the Wii SCAR worth recommending? Let's find out. In 2002, US SOCOM solicited a new multi-caliber family of small arms with which to equip US Special Operations Forces. Many major contractors submitted proposals, but it was Fabrique Nationale that won with their SCAR-L, SCAR-H, and SSR, ultimately designated the Mark 16, Mark 17, and Mark 20 respectively. Per the requirements of the program, these were all conventional short-stroke piston-operated guns that incorporated modern design features, provided high modularity and reliability. Unfortunately for FN, the SCAR-L demonstrated a few design and implementation issues and was not considered enough of an improvement over the M4 to warrant full replacement. So while its 7.62 counterparts stuck around as they offered unique capability to SOCOM, the SCAR-L never got much attention, and by 2010 it was decided that no more SCAR-Ls would be purchased. The SCAR-H would go on to receive a 5.56 conversion package, possibly as a way for the Navy to keep 5.56 SCARs in inventory despite the cancellation, because SEALs apparently like them and inter-service politics is a big bag of sunshine and rainbows. But the SCAR-L itself was dead in the water and lives on only in our hearts, dreams, a handful of non-US COTS purchases, semi-auto range toys, and every single first-person shooter released between 2005 and 2015. Could be worse. This Wii is a replica of the CQB variant with 10-inch barrel, and obviously in a black finish as opposed to the 50 shades of tan that the SCAR is iconic for. But despite being the less popular coloration, there is still an interesting mix of finishes going on here, so let's get into the specifics. The muzzle device is an A2 style birdcage that Wii supplied to replace the included orange tip, and this is standard 14mm negative threading, not much to say here. The gas block behind it houses the faux gas regulator and the flip-up front sight, and has a sparkly gray finish that reminds me of A&K's. The front sight has a bit of front to back play when deployed, which is accurate to the real thing, but also a bit of lateral play, which is not. If we jump back to the rear sight, we find that it also has play in both axes. Does this matter for airsoft use? Probably not, particularly since they do seem to have enough spring tension to roughly return to zero, but it looks and feels cheap, again a reminder of the sort of external quality we see on cheap AEGs. Which actually belies the materials, considering this rear sight is steel, and so are the outer barrel and takedown pin. The receiver itself feels like an aluminum heavy alloy and has smooth black anodization, and the charging handle and trigger are also steel. So the external parts quality here is pretty good once you start digging into it. It's really just the wobble and sparkly Twilight Vampire finish that give a bad first impression. Anyways, the front sight adjusts for elevation exactly like an AR sight, while the rear sight has a wheel for windage and a rotating drum for range. And note that these are very tall compared to AR irons, which we'll discuss more when we get to practicality. The receiver has 3 rails that help secure the front barrel bracket, so are functionally integral to the design. The charging handle is fixed to the bolt, though it can be mounted on either side when field stripping, and again, more on this later. The markings are, the kind of cutesy, partly correct but obviously airsoft style. A real SCAR-L would of course be marked 5.56mm and omit this licensing line, plus would have a 5-digit serial starting with LC. The font and logo are just a little off, and most real SCAR-Ls would have US manufacturer markings, which are absent here. On the right side, the bolt is just visible as more speckled gray through the narrow ejection port, and the deflector is a separate plastic piece. Moving down to the lower, this is all nylon, and it's thin enough that I can compress the magwell or slightly deflect the trigger guard, though there are no obvious weak points. While the trigger is steel as mentioned, the mag release and selector are alloy, and the pistol grip is a real spec AR A2 grip, and a real steel grip will drop in. The selector is very interesting to me because it has the same selection pattern as an AR, and this is accurate to SCARs procured by the Navy. The original SCAR-L had 45-degree increments, which in turn is what we copied for their previous SCARs, though it seems they have been making this AR-like pattern for at least a couple of years. We have a pretty solid guess as to why, you'll see. The stock is plastic with a rubber butt pad, as on the real thing, and has a number of interesting features. It can fold to the side and hook onto the deflector, using the flex of the plastic to snap into place, and then deploys just by pulling on it. It has 6 length positions, but it also has a movable cheek rest for comfort when using taller optics. Lastly, I should also mention that the stock has a sling loop on the top, then the receiver has 2 loops on the left side of the rear, another on the right, and one on either side of the front, so there are a bunch of options here for sling setups. The magazine included with the gun is Wii's latest revision of their Stanag magazine with a dark gray finish. This is kinda weird because it's neither black like FN's nor chalky gray like USGI. It does at least have a pretty good surface finish, though note that on some mags the floor plate rattles out of the box. This is fixable by introducing a slight bend, which I was able to do with my bare hands. Not making any gorilla jokes today, this is just very soft alloy. Oh, and the mag has an overall weight of 368 grams, pretty light by GBB standards. Overall, I'm actually surprised at how decent the externals are on this gun. gun. They are not on the level of modern GHK or VFC releases, but even those companies weren't putting steel barrels on their rifles until fairly recently. More importantly, having owned a bunch of Wiis over the years, I can say this is a far cry from some of the older, glossy black painted pop metal releases, and it's cool to see this improvement. The cheesy markings, sparkly gas block, and wobbly sights probably won't impress collectors, but the plastic and aluminum that comprise the majority of this replica are appropriate materials. At 6 3/4 pounds or 3.1 kilograms, it is noticeably lighter than its real counterpart, but not egregiously so, and the general fitment and build quality feel good. Field stripping is quite easy. First, pushing out the cross pin at the front of the lower allows it to pivot down and slide out from the stock. That frees the stock to slide downwards and off, which in turn releases the recoil assembly out the back. The bolt can now come to the disassembly position and the charging handle pulls out, and then the bolt slides out the back. Well, that wasn't supposed to happen. Let's try that again. And then the bolt slides out the back. There we go. Now normally, accessing the hop up will require a bit more work. There are 4 screws which secure the hop unit to the receiver, and these are attached to compression springs for retention. Next, the bottom rail comes off with 2 screws, one of which secures the hop unit in place. On the side rails, I just need to unscrew the front 2 screws, and with a bit of play, the outer barrel should fit through the front bracket. And now I should be able to slide the hop unit forwards, but again, those retained screws aren't quite letting go, so I need to loosen their housing slightly. Okay, it can move, so I just slide it forwards into this cutout and lift it up, and it doesn't want to do that either, so it takes some fiddling and kind of prying the receiver apart to get it out. I suppose it's better for parts to be too tight rather than too loose, but when it gets in the way of normal disassembly, it's a bit of a pain. And I had to disassemble right out of the box because the hop nub was biased all the way to one side and causing every shot to hook right. There's a grub screw here which should secure this hop unit to the chamber, but it loosened itself from shooting, which goes to show that it's very important to make sure all securing screws in this gun are either tight or thread locked. So this is a typical clamshell hop unit design using a half wheel to actuate a traditional hop arm with separate nub. The problem is the nub is not as long as the window is wide, so it has to be carefully centered on reassembly to avoid biasing the hop to either side, which is doable, it's just annoying. The stock tensioner is a solid cylinder, so it would be easy to glue it to the hop arm, but with a contoured tensioner like this, it would be better to shim either side of the window to eliminate the potential for lateral play. Given this gun came with the nub stuck all the way to one side, we can at least rule out the idea that we were sent a golden QC sample. The stock inner barrel is 250mm, and like other Wii guns, it is not quite the standard GBB spec, being just a little shorter at the breech end relative to its indexing cuts. This means standard GBB buckings will have a lot of dead space and not quite fit right, while standard barrels won't fit the Wii bucking, so if you want to swap either the bucking or barrel, you have to swap both. What you see here is a quad bucking and nub with a Poseidon barrel because we found that the stock setup was very inconsistent about the amount of hop applied when used with 32s. However, we were later able to massively improve the stock setup by only replacing the nub. While this contoured nub applied too much tension and over hop point 32s even set to 0, subbing in a Mad Bull H nub achieved good results, and we'll show that later during performance. Leaving aside the specific setups, this hop unit reliably aligns the barrel, it has a provision for the indexing tab on the bucking, and the hop arm has negligible lateral play, so it produces consistent pressure as long as the nub is centered. This all means that the gun is capable of the same level of hop performance as the MWS or its clones, and has all the same flexibility in choice of barrel, bucking, and nub. It's just that if you want to swap the bucking, you'll need to replace the barrel too. Onto the bolt carrier, which is a fairly simple alloy block and weighs 278 grams. The charging handle is another 15 grams for a total of 293 grams of reciprocating mass, just a little bit lower than most ARs and AKs on the market, which are in the 300-350 gram range. Notice that it has rollers built into the top, reducing friction as it travels, which is a nice touch. And the charging handle can be installed on either side since it just slots into the carrier and is retained by the receiver. To remove the nozzle, first it's necessary to pop out a small cross pin which holds the nozzle return spring. Next, remove the 2 large screws from the top half of the carrier. This exposes the nozzle stop, which is held by 2 screws. There's a small cutout to use something like a dental pick to pry it out, but it's easier to just push it out from the inside. And lastly, there is a nozzle guide on the left side, which comes out the same way. Here's the nozzle. It doesn't seal all that well in the carrier at rest, but the O-ring expands to seal provided it can build enough pressure. I can disassemble further by pushing out this cross pin, which splits the nozzle and dumps out the return spring, rocket valve, and rocket valve spring. Out of the box, this gun did almost 1.8 joules, so for a 1.5 joule environment, it will be necessary to reduce power. As always, we have a public tutorial on our Patreon for gluing in tubing to reduce power, and you do not need to be a patron to view it, though if you are, we appreciate you. The other option is to get a drop-in adjustable valve, and RA Tech has made one for ages, though they do tend to be inconsistent at lower values. Otherwise, this nozzle is fine, with no immediately concerning weak points in the feed arm or front aperture, though we do notice that the two halves don't fit together especially tightly, and a significant leak here might impact cold weather performance. We do also need to talk about the bolt catch, but we'll come back to that after looking at the fire control. The recoil system is a captive spring on a plastic guide with a plastic short-stroke tubular buffer and a rubber buffer for shock absorption. The rubber reduces shock on impact, so we do not anticipate any problems relating to bolt carrier stress. The fire control group is the most interesting part of this release because it's historically the weak point on Wii GBBRs. To remove it, I first loosen the grub screw on one side selector and carefully pry it off without losing the ball bearing and spring, then gently extract the selector out the other side, again without losing parts. Now I can just unscrew one main screw in the back and a smaller one on the right side of the gun, and I can pull the bolt catch and trigger pack out the top. This is a Wii AR trigger pack. Sure, it has this linkage to actuate the auto sear, so it isn't quite identical, but the real SCAR pack is unsurprisingly closer to the FNC, while this is Wii reusing design from the AR. Obviously, the use of an internal trigger pack to begin with is a departure from strict realism, so it isn't particularly an issue that this is patterned off an AR, but it does mean there is parts compatibility with other Wii rifles. Now, the big deal for the version 3.1 guns is that the hammer, disconnector, trigger, and auto sear, all the primary fire control surfaces, are steel. We see little wear on the contact points, so in stark contrast to the earlier guns, these should never need replacement. That said, there are a couple of issues and design details to note. First, this hammer spring is outrageously strong. We've been told that swapping for an AMG winter hammer spring improves efficiency significantly, but we weren't able to get one in time for this video, so unfortunately cannot evaluate yet. Note that unlike most gas ARs currently on the market, this gun does actually have a valve knocker lock, which helps with cold weather, but at the cost of increasing gas consumption. Notice also that the hammer has a roller, which in combination with the rollers on top of the bolt carrier, allows the bolt to move with very little friction in the receiver, and that should in turn decrease gas consumption. We'll see the full result of all these little details when we get to performance. The second issue is with the hammer to trigger interface. As I pull the trigger, during the initial take-up you can see how the hammer is releasing very slightly. This is what is termed negative engagement, and the hammer scraping against the trigger produces a gritty trigger feel. Too much negative engagement can also allow the sear surfaces to skip off one another, and then a gun may start doubling or sporadically firing when the trigger is released, but here there is enough of a wall after the initial take-up that we don't think this is likely. Third, at some point in the course of disassembly, both of these small cast blocks that retain the auto sear transfer bar cracked and then broke. This could be considered a skill issue, and we repaired them with a bit of superglue, and in theory they should not be under any significant lateral stress once assembled, but if you take out the trigger pack, you should be very careful about these parts. They are at least readily replaceable. And fourth, the bolt catch cams this lever, which in turn rotates a steel catch plate upwards to catch on a steel insert in the bolt. While it is steel on steel, there's very little engagement surface area here and wear is noticeable. The catch plate does have some room for over travel against a spring-loaded plunger, which is essentially how the Tokyo Marui Z plate functions as we covered in our DE review, but the spring on this plunger is so strong that I can't depress it at all by hand. We strongly suspect that right now it isn't doing any buffering, and it would need a weaker spring to actually cushion the blow. So erosion to the bolt is a concern, and since the insert is not sold separately, may require a full bolt replacement to fix. We suggest not touching the fire control group if you can avoid it, but if you do need to remove any parts, take them out by driving out the cross pins rather than separating the two halves of the trigger housing, which will just result in parts and springs flying everywhere. On reassembly, be very careful not to crush the spring for the bolt release while also making sure it drops below the linkage arm in the trigger pack. It also helps to heavily grease the selector springs and ball bearings just so they stay put, and push the disconnector back to help get the selector axle through. The magazine is another area where Wii has iterated over time, though there are no dramatic changes for this release. Removing the base plate exposes the single screw securing the shell to the internals of the magazine, and with that out, the internals slide out the top. To show how this is constructed, I'll now remove the side plate, very carefully keeping the follower spring under control as it attempts to launch itself across the room. Note that there is a spacer at the bottom of the spring which can be removed to increase BB capacity. Well, now unscrewing the bottom of the mag separates the two halves of the mag. And while I'm here, I'll take out this funny screw on the side which reveals a hinged connector. If you're familiar with old Western Arms gas mags, you might be having flashbacks, but it's not actually that bad. Basically, there's a single O-ring serving as a gasket between the two halves of the reservoir, and then each of these extra screws that holds it together has an O-ring. All three of these are compressed hard by their respective screws when the magazine is fully assembled, so it does seal up well. The problem is just accessing this middle one, because having removed the follower spring, I'm now going to suffer immensely trying to stuff it back in. The best way we've found is to reattach the cover plate to the top and then try to use the mag halves to guide the spring back in, but it's still a colossal pain in the ass. Fortunately, all the other functional parts of the mag can be accessed without taking the lower section apart at all. Up top, the feed lips are held in by two screws, and the stop on empty tab for the follower will keep it from launching into the ceiling when the feed lips are removed. The gas router is chunky and seals well, and we haven't noticed erosion from use. Know that there is a dry fire switch, and several of our mags were delivered with them set to dry fire mode, so be sure to push them forwards to enable the stop on empty. Lastly, while the output valve looks like a standard Marui output valve with a Kong toy stuck to it, there's one key detail revealed by disassembling it, and that's the presence of an O-ring on the valve stem, which helps to minimize gas loss at low pressure. Designs that omit this O-ring tend to struggle in cold weather, and while the hammer and recoil springs are clearly designed for Taiwanese summer, the presence of a valve knocker lock in this O-ring will help with cold weather performance. This mag holds 31 BBs, or 36 with the spacer removed, and fills to about 17 grams of propane, though it will siphon on auto beyond about 14 grams. Unlike VFC mags, it can be fully loaded and still seat easily on a closed bolt, so it isn't necessary to knock out the top BB, and it can load straight down through the feed lips without any adapter, which is cool. Those are nice perks, and while the BB and gas capacities are nothing special and the core design is a little dated, there's nothing really wrong with this magazine, and it does everything it needs to. While the magazine is unremarkable, the gun itself represents a credible effort at improvement, and at the very least a night and day difference from some of the Wiis I've owned in the past. The switch to a full steel fire control group certainly addresses the biggest complaint about Wiis in general, but there are still some lingering issues that demonstrate how simply switching from pot metal to steel is not a silver bullet fix for design flaws. And while needing to replace hot parts on a brand new gun is generally not a deal breaker, the proprietary design means replacing the bucking requires replacing the inner barrel as well, and that is a substantially more expensive alteration. But we'll talk through upgrade paths later, onto controls and operation. The SCAR L is by design AR adjacent, particularly in this Navy configuration. Mag insertion and release work just like an AR, and note that the ambi mag release is standard. The selector toggles easily, clicking nicely into place. Out of the box, the trigger has a gritty 4.5 pound take-up, then hits a wall before braking at 5.5 pounds. It's a clean brake, and there's next to no over travel, plus a very tactile reset, but that initial take-up really sucks due to the negative engagement as covered earlier. In any case, the charging handle is fixed on either the left or right side, so manipulating the bolt to chamber around or manually lock open is easy, but the small size of the ejection port makes hop adjustment a little tricky. A small screwdriver or multi-tool is essential for making adjustments to the hop in the field. Dropping the bolt takes a bit of force, and the gun will not release the bolt just from impact, indicating that there have been geometric alterations since earlier SCARs, which would tend to drop too easily or not lock open at all. The bolt slams forwards with authority and a nice metal on metal clang. Well, with all that said, let's actually shoot it. This is better than I expected. Not a ton of moving mass, but it's a sharp blowback and snappy cycle with a nicely metallic report. So while the recoil isn't particularly strong, it's still punchy and feels pretty good to shoot. Well, with the usual 1 shot per second until failure to lock back, we see just under 100 shots on a 17 gram fill. That's not great, but testing strings of 30 with time to warm up, it manages 4 full mags and then gasses out during the 5th. In full auto, we see siphoning on the first mag, and it gets through a second, but runs out before finishing a third. So best to slightly underfill if using full auto, and if possible refill after each mag. Now with such heavy recoil and hammer springs, we didn't expect much when chilled to freezing, and yet it's able to clear multiple mags back to back. Odd, isn't it? Essentially due to heavy recoil and hammer springs plus a valve knocker lock, this is less efficient than a VFC or GHK AR, and with the relatively low gas capacity, that means it doesn't get nearly as many shots per fill. At the same time, good seals plus the valve knocker lock keep it from choking at low pressure the way we typically see on a heavily sprung gun, and that enables it to work just fine even on propane and freezing. It's sluggish under those conditions, of course, and efficiency could be improved with a weaker hammer spring, but out of the box this is remarkably similar in shots per fill and cold weather performance to the just justifiably well like TMMWS. Consistency and cooldown are very good, going from just under 1.5 joules to about 1.3 joules over the course of a mag, deviating only by a few FPS from shot to shot. While the stock hop was poor with .32s, with the H-nub as discussed earlier, there's just a little bit of hopping consistency, but otherwise I'm being limited by the sights more than the hop. This is a surprisingly solid performer, with the caveat that, like the MWS, it benefits from being regassed on every reload if possible. So, practicality and aftermarket. The basic SCAR with its quad rails is a little ergonomically outdated nowadays, but nowhere to the degree of the stuff I usually like. Our contact at Wii said it would be super cool to see us put some real accessories on it, so here you go, with some more or less era-appropriate gadgets. A CAC broom handle, or maybe a VFC copy, I don't remember or really care. We got an EOTech 512 on top, a Modlite PLH V2 in an aftermarket Surefire 6-piece style body mounted by a Weaver scope ring. So what we get is a gun the size of a Mark 18 and with extremely similar controls but some nice little perks. I already mentioned how the stock can fold and collapse, and the integral cheek riser is nice for getting a consistent cheek weld, particularly with taller optics. Speaking of which, note that this EOTech is designed to co-witness with standard AR irons, but the SCAR irons are considerably taller. While this gun really ought to be used with an optic, if necessary the irons are conducive to CQB shooting and a heads-up posture. I just wish they weren't so wobbly, and they could stand to have a larger rear aperture for low light. The rest of the controls are essentially just an ambi AR. In most respects, this feels like an evolution of the 2000s era quad rail AR, except for two problems which, unsurprisingly, it inherits from its real counterpart. First, this charging handle is generally mounted to the left side for a right-handed shooter. The problem is that because it reciprocates, it's easy to accidentally block it with a magwell grip or to scrape knuckles on an optic when charging it. I find I have to think about how I'm gripping the gun to avoid causing problems, which is never ideal. Of course, the charging handle can be simply mounted to the opposite side, and as with the AR, you don't need to touch the charging handle when reloading, so it's not a big deal. Second, and this is one of the big problems the real SCAR faced, the stock is plastic and has integral plastic hinges. While those hinges are pretty beefy and the stock is well supported when locked into the gun, it is still plastic, and if enough force is applied, it will snap at the hinges. Obviously best to avoid subjecting a toy gun to that kind of stress in the first place, but it's something to be aware of, particularly when the stock is folded up. As far as aftermarket, as mentioned, there are winter hammer springs for this gun that unfortunately we have not been able to test, but have been highly recommended to us for improving efficiency and cold weather capability. The hop setup warrants either just an H-nub or a full replacement of barrel, bucking, and nub, in which case we suggest a unicorn barrel paired with quad bucking and nub. There are also adjustable rocket valve solutions, which are standard across Wii guns. ACR style stocks are available, and standard AR pistol grips will drop right in, so there's some furniture options, and if you're more a fan of the 14.5-inch SCAR, then Wii does sell a barrel extension to achieve that look. Beyond those parts though, most aftermarket exists to compensate for the fragile fire control parts of the previous generation and is no longer applicable. All straightforward stuff, which brings us to conclusions in pricing. The externals are generally good with a surprising amount of steel and decent aluminum and plastic, but some pot metal parts, cheesy finishes, and wobble. Internally is similarly generally good, with the hop needing at least a new nub and possibly recentering right out of the box, but a solidly designed bulk carrier and most importantly a full steel fire control group. It still has some issues that demonstrate how materials alone can never substitute for good design, but it represents a massive improvement over the older guns where fire control failure was an inevitability. Magazines are easy to load and work fine, though the gas capacity is unremarkable and the coloration is odd. The shooting experience is quite nice with snappy cycle and decent recoil. It has usable efficiency and surprisingly good cold weather performance, and with hop tweaking or replacement can achieve excellent accuracy. Consistency is good, ergonomics are good, SCAR specific aftermarket is limited but no longer necessary for continued function. In general, besides the stock hop not performing very well, everything else about the gun ranges from acceptable to very good, which is high marks for a budget GBBR brand. Speaking of budget, Wii has informed us that the new SCARs will have an increase in distributor price of $30, which we expect will translate to a roughly $30 to $50 increase in retail price, which puts retail price in the US at between $400 and $420. Well, if you want a SCAR L, the only other option is the MWS-based Guns Modify SCAR L. While we haven't extensively examined the Guns Modify, we have gotten to try one out at a local field, and I can safely say that although it does have nicer build quality, it isn't massively different, it performs about the same, and the recoil was a bit underwhelming. That makes the Wii a cost-effective alternative unless you're already invested in MWS magazines. Beyond SCARs, the cost is comparable to the Double Eagle AR we previously recommended as a budget GBBR, and the recommended upgrades are similarly minimal and cheap. Even with the price increase, this is significantly better value for money than the older Wiis, and the build quality and performance are now comparable to some of the older VFCs we've reviewed. The ideal audience here is someone who cares cares about performance more than build quality or realism, but wants something a little more fun to shoot than the functional but unremarkable MWS. WE makes a lot of different GBBRs, and if they continue to apply these improvements in design and materials to other products, I suspect we'll be seeing a lot more WEs on the field. In particular, if the new ARs are up to the same standards as his SCAR, they'll be a decent alternative to the currently unavailable VFC ARs, so we're very interested to see how those turn out. But where the SCAR is concerned, that's all for today. If you enjoyed this video, consider checking out our Patreon linked in the description, and thanks for watching.